I want to look at the Homestead Act first with you guys. And the Homestead Act was a huge thing for getting people to move west, but it also explains like why did different things develop in our country when they did. It was in 1862. It was signed by President Lincoln, and if you see on that map, all the red states were states that were impacted by the Homestead Act. And so the East Coast wasn't really impacted because that was already crowded, right? Texas was its own thing. Texas was a republic. Its own kind of did their own thing for a long time, so that wasn't part of it at the time either. But then you see the rest of the country pretty much was part of the Homestead Act. And that really brought people west. In fact, like the neighborhood right over there, some of you might live in, is what Homestead something it's named after. So the Homestead Act actually accounted for the numbers are all over the place because records stink, and so many of these records were just penned in a book somewhere at some library that or town hall that probably burned down at one point. But like most things I've read say around 10% of the country was settled via the Homestead Act. Okay, so a huge number, but I've seen from other sources anywhere up to 30% of our country was settled by the Homestead Act. So super big. It says there, I thought it was 1976, but maybe it was 1986. But it was just during my lifetime that the Homestead Act went away. So they kept it for a really long time to try to encourage people to settle in places that weren't already populated. The Settlement Act had a big, really big bonus if you did it. It was 160 acres that you would get for free if you settled the land and farmed on it for 5 years or more. Okay, so it was basically your own free 160 acres. You guys know 160 acres nowadays is an unbelievable amount of land in a populated area, right? But guess what? All these areas that are populated now, at one point, were homesteaded. And so the people passed down the land family to family, generation to generation, made millions off of the land in different places in the country over time. Okay? Some of that land is farmland, and they made a lot of money off of that as well. But this was a smart way for the United States to say, hey, let's move where people don't already live. Now, I know you guys already read about the Dawes Act in the last unit too, which was kind of based off of this Homestead Act in that it gave 160 acres to the head of a Native American household if they settled land that they were on and would stay there. But this Homestead Act was a big way to bring people to the West, and it was pretty darn successful as far as programs, federal programs go. Now, at the same time, around in 1862, President Lincoln signed another act called the Morrill Act. It was the Morrill Land Grant Act. And that was big in that the federal government told states, hey, if you either build agricultural colleges, meaning farming colleges, okay, to teach people how to farm, or you sell our federal land, then use the proceeds to build colleges, agricultural colleges, you will get that land for free from us. So the federal government told the states, hey, you can have this land for free if you either build farming colleges on it or sell the land and then use that money to build colleges for agriculture later on. And so that was a way to expand not only the settling of the West and a lot of the country, but also to improve our higher education infrastructure. Specifically, they wanted to make sure there were a lot of people who knew how to farm and do it well. So if you guys, just a little tip, around the country, you guys have heard like Colorado State, Indiana State, Michigan State, all these different places that are named state. Almost all of the colleges, not everyone, but most of the colleges that have state at the end ended up coming from that Morrill land grant. Okay, that's when those colleges were founded. So a lot of the colleges that ended state originally were agricultural colleges. Like anybody that's familiar with Colorado State knows it used to be an agricultural college. And sometimes, like once a year, they usually do that throwback where they wear their orange and green uniforms. and that comes from back when it was an agricultural school. Okay? So like that's a lot of the country, or a lot of the colleges around the country that Penn State came from this grant. Now, obviously, over time, we became more of a industrial country, and then more of a service industry country, and the colleges aren't focused on agriculture as much anymore. But that's where a lot of the universities got their roots, were from this Morrill land grant. They started in 1862, and then there was a follow-up one in 1890. And this was big because the follow-up one focused on agricultural schools and building them for African Americans. Because remember, we're still living in the time back in the 1800s where there was a lot of segregation and a lot of inequality and whatnot. And that was telling states, hey, if you'll make sure that you build a school that's for African Americans to learn agriculture and whatnot, then we'll also give you this land for free. Okay? So that helped bring a lot of those colleges that ended up being like focused on African American students at the time. So a lot of the, I don't know if you guys have heard the term HBCU, but HBCU stands for historically black colleges and universities. A lot of those colleges and universities have been around for a really long time, back into the 1800s. So even though it wasn't necessarily as common for someone who's African American to be in college because of financial issues, having had their families maybe start as slaves and all that kind of stuff, there's a long history of that. And they've started to become a little bit more in the news as far as like drawing attention to it. Like, for example, one of the vice presidential candidates, Kamala Harris, went to Howard, which was an HBCU. Right? So kind of a lot of those get their roots from around the same time period as well. So I just wanted to point that out to you guys. So those are just two things I wanted to highlight that were big to try to get people to the West. And also right around the same time period as the Transcontinental Railroad, right around the same time period as the Bessemer process made steel easier to make. Like all this stuff that started happening at once. Literally, guys, like if somebody was frozen from like 1860 until like 1910, like for 50 years, and they were from like Europe, and they woke up and they were told like the United States is one of the big powers of the world, they think you were nuts because we were just these little guys that were a new country, only less than 100 years old when that first would have been frozen. And now all of a sudden, we just boomed, okay? And the thing was, we were able to do it really quickly because so much of the land just wasn't developed. The population was so concentrated in the East Coast, we were able to start fresh. You had things like the Chicago fire happen, and then all of a sudden they basically start over in downtown Chicago with all new skyscrapers, all new buildings, and everything just went up really quickly. So that's kind of how our country, it went from nothing to like big deal really quickly. So just wanted to point those things out before you did the rest of the reading on populism. So are there any questions that anybody has about the Morrill Acts or the Homestead Act